I just filmed this whole thing and then the camera just stopped and now I have to redo the whole thing and I'm so annoyed, but I guess let's go again. So today I'm doing my March wrap-up, which is me talking through all of the books that I read in March. And in March I started and finished 9 books total. So I'm going to talk about those 9 today. I also started one other book, which I mentioned in my April TBR, which is The Group by Mary McCarthy. And so I read like 135 pages in this book, so those pages also count for my total page count for March. Now, in total, I read 2,634 pages in March, which comes down to about 85 pages a day, which sounds great. It's a little bit more than I did last month. I do have to say though that 5 of the books that I read, which is about 1,000 pages, were graphic novels. So that makes the whole thing a lot less impressive, and I actually don't feel great about how much I read this month. I'm not very impressed with myself. Now for genres, I read 8 fantasy books and 1 kind of general fiction. I don't know how to classify this book. And so not very diverse in genres this month, but I love fantasy, so I don't really mind. For age range, I read 8 adult books and 1 young adult, which is the first young adult book I read this year because I'm not really a young adult reader. I am very much so an adult reader with an occasional sprinkling of like young adults or middle grade. For ratings, it was kind of all over the place. I had 1 5-star, 1 4.5 star, 1 4.25 star, 2 4 stars, 2 3.75 stars, 1 3.5 stars, and 1 3.25 stars. So a little bit all over the place, a lot of quarter stars and stuff because I can't control myself. My average was a 4, which is the same as I had last month, which I feel really good about because, you know, I want it to be about a 4. I don't really want it to be much lower than that because I am quite generous with my ratings. So if my average is below a 4, then that's kind of a bad month for me. I enjoyed the graphic novels that I read on average a lot more than the actual novels that I read. And obviously the novels take up a lot more time out of the month. So for a lot more of the time during the month, I felt slumpy and a little disappointed with what I was reading. Now I'm gonna start with talking through the 4 like actual novels that I read, and then I'll talk about the graphic novels after that. Now my least favorite book that I read this month, and the one that I will start with, is Eva Luna by Isabel Allende. And this is an adult fiction. I don't really know how to classify it. It does feel a bit like historical fiction based on when it takes place, but it's also written quite a long time ago. It's written in the 80s, so it wasn't quite historical fiction for the time when it was written, but I don't know. It also has some magical realism themes, but it's not as magical as I would have expected from hearing magical realism, so I don't really know where to put it. It's also kind of literary fiction, I guess. I'm just gonna classify it as like fiction. It's about this character, Eva Luna, who we follow her from before her birth. We follow her mother for a little bit at the beginning, and then we follow her like for several like decades of her life, from when she's a child to when she's an adult. It's definitely a character-driven book, I have to say. There's not a strong plot, let's say that. It's quite meandering. It's just kind of following her life, mostly. Some people love that. Some people, like me, are maybe a little bit more skeptical about it. It made me a little bit frustrated, in a way. I kept wanting it to move more decisively. Not necessarily faster, but just in a clearer direction, in a way. But obviously people's lives don't move in clear directions, so it makes sense for it to be a little bit more kind of meandering, but it wasn't necessarily my favorite. I thought the characters in here were really vivid. I thought several of the characters were great. Got to know them quite quickly. I feel like Isabel Allende really did a lot of great work with characterization, so I really enjoyed those aspects. So even though this is my least favorite of the month, I didn't dislike it at all. I was just I was a little bored for parts of it. I was a little meh about quite a bit of it, but also I enjoyed some parts. I don't know, I was a bit conflicted about it. I gave it a 3.25 because a 3 for me is like, I was completely meh. And for this, I was still a little bit more positive. I think for some people this would be amazing, for people who really like that kind of life story, character driven, not such a clear plot kind of book. I know some people really love that. For me, I think I am a little bit more plot driven than that, even though I do love characters as well. And for me, it gets a little bit frustrating in a way, where nothing really is moving the way I would like it to be moving. I don't know. Not that there isn't anything that happens in this book, there's a lot of stuff that happens. I do have to say though that I read the Swedish translation. The book is originally written in Spanish, and because I can't read Spanish anywhere near well enough to actually read a full book, I read the Swedish translation. But I'm sure the English translation would work equally well. I thought the Swedish translation was good. I didn't have any obvious problems with it. The next book that I have is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Now, this is part of my project to read more Neil Gaiman so that I can actually say that he's one of my favorite authors. And in that way, this book was a little bit of a failure because I didn't love it anywhere near as much as I wished that I would. It's an adult fantasy, kind of a low fantasy where it takes place, you know, in our world, but with more magical elements. And it was written in the 90s and it takes place in the 90s. It follows this like young businessman in London. He helps a woman who he finds bleeding on the street, and that leads to his whole life getting like uprooted and him falling through the cracks, they call it. Basically, he becomes forgotten and he almost becomes invisible to normal people. That leads to him kind of journeying to this place called London Below, which is the London for the people who have fallen through the cracks, who normal London, which they call London Above, has forgotten and doesn't deal with anymore. And so he goes there and he ends up on kind of a quest with some other characters. And London Below is like literally London below. It's like sewers and all that kind of stuff. Like sewers, subway platforms, like below. It's like below. I think I wanted this book to be something kind of different from what it was. I think I wanted it to be more whimsical, more magical, you know? And it's not that it's not that, but it's a little bit more realistic. It's a lot more like sewage, you know? It's a lot more of that than I was maybe hoping for. I was hoping for something a little bit more glittery, which I don't think is really something I should be expecting from Neil Gaiman. He doesn't really seem to be a glittery kind of writer, which I feel like I should kind of know that by now. I think I went in expecting the wrong thing. On the back it says, under the streets of London, it's a place most people could never even dream of. A city of monsters and saints, murderers and angels, knights in armor and pale girls in black velvet. This is the city of the people who have fallen between the cracks. And yeah, that's like literally, like all those things are in here, but I think I expected something different, I think. It was still a cool experience and I thought some parts of it were really, really good. I really liked the the villains, the murderers in the description. I thought they were incredible. I can't remember what their names are. It's Mr. Something and Mr. Something. Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandemar. I thought they were awesome. They were super scary and creepy and weird and I didn't like them, but also I kind of loved them. I kind of grew attached to them in a strange way. I don't know. But obviously, this book shows that Neil Gaiman has cool ideas and he's a cool writer, but it's not the perfect book for me. I think this was the first book that he published on his own, and I think this was maybe, you know, it's more of an early effort, and I don't think this was the perfect place for me to go in my journey with Neil Gaiman. But it was still cool. It still had cool things going on. Like, I didn't dislike it. I gave it a 3.5 because I enjoyed parts of it, but I did struggle with getting into it. I never super got into it. Like, even in the end, I was kind of like, eh. So 3.5, I think, is a good rating for it. Definitely didn't put me off reading more Neil Gaiman. It just made me more interested. I'm definitely going to continue on that journey. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as one of your first Neil Gaiman books. The next book that I have is Circe by Madeline Miller. This is also an adult fantasy, but this is kind of a historical, mythological fantasy because it follows Circe, who obviously is a character in Greek mythology. She's most known for being the kind of witch on the island in the Odyssey who turns Odysseus' men into pigs, if you're familiar with that story. And so this is just her life, basically, her life as, you know, a minor goddess and how she gets exiled and what she kind of does with her exile. You know, it's, if you're familiar with Circe in Greek mythology and all the stuff that she gets up to in Greek mythology, because she is in a lot of it. Like, she's in a lot of different stuff. She's got her fingers in a lot of different pots, which I wasn't fully aware of. I just really thought of her as the witch from the Odyssey. I never really knew that she had other parts to play in Greek mythology. But it follows the Greek myths and the Greek stories very closely. So the story beats are, you know, if you read the Wikipedia page on Circe, then you pretty much know what's going to go down in this book. But obviously, you know, you get a lot of internal stuff and a lot of her, you know, motivations and that kind of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily get in, you know, in the Odyssey. You don't really know what she's thinking. So I thought this book was going to be like the perfect book for me because I love adult fantasy and I also love Greek mythology. And in some ways, I did love it. I loved getting the full story about Circe because, you know, I know quite a bit about Greek mythology, but I didn't know quite all that much about her specifically. So I'm really glad to really have that knowledge, to be able to just knowledge dump on people about Circe. I did struggle with really attaching myself to the book. I don't really know why. I feel like the only character that you really get attached to, or at least the only character that I got attached to, was Circe herself. I feel like pretty much all other characters, or to me, like all other characters, were really distant in a way. And I kind of struggled with that in a way. I thought parts of it were really cool. I thought the experience of time was really interesting because obviously being a goddess, she is immortal. So time works differently for her, basically. Like, you know, 10 years is really nothing to her. So I thought that aspect was really interesting in a way. Like, time isn't really that relevant to her. In ways I thought it was really cool. It didn't hit me the way I wanted it to hit me, and I can't really put my finger on why. I didn't grow attached to it in the way that I had wanted. I gave it a 3.75 because I didn't quite think it was a 4, but it was like almost there, so 3.75. Yeah, I'm not writing off Madeline Miller. I still think she's an interesting writer. I still love Greek mythology, so I am still interested in her book, The Song of Achilles, which it seems like some people think is better than this one, even though this one is the more famous one. I picked up this one both because I'd heard more about this one, and because Circe as a character appeals to me more than Achilles and Patroclus. But I have heard that Song of Achilles is supposed to be really good, so I probably will pick that one up at some point. I really don't know when. It's not a priority, but I'll get there at some point, you know. Final actual novel that I finished in this month is Fireborne by Rosaria Munda, and which is the first book in the Aurelian cycle, which is a new trilogy. I believe the second book was just released, so I'm definitely gonna pick that one up at some point. And so this is young adult fantasy, and the first young adult book that I have read this year. And it follows Annie and Lee, so it's a dual perspective. And when they were children, there was a revolution in their country. And they both ended up orphans and grew up together in an orphanage. And before the revolution, their country was ruled by a class of dragon riders who were, you know, the lords and quite oppressive to the normal people. Annie's family were, you know, farmers, lowborn, and her whole family was executed by dragon fire. They were burned to death by a dragon lord. And she was the only survivor. And so that's how she ended up in the orphanage. Lee, on the other hand, his family were dragon lords. They were rulers. They were aristocrats. And so his whole family was murdered, including his, you know, siblings and everything, during the revolution. And that's how he ended up an orphan. And since then, you know, being a dragon rider used to be exclusive to the ruling class, but now after the revolution, it's been opened up to be accessible to everyone, so you can like test to become a dragon rider. And so Annie and Lee are both in the dragon riding academy, and they're competing to become like the lead dragon rider. They and like a bunch of the other teenagers in the academy are in this big competition, so there's that aspect. It doesn't take up a lot of the book, but there's still some of that like competition, dragon riding competition aspect. I don't know how to feel about this book. I read this book, it was the first book I read this month. I had great momentum from the end of last month, and I read this book in like a few days, and it's not a short book, it's like 430 something pages. So I read it quickly, and I had a great mood, like a great like flow, like, which was really killed by later books. Not because I hated them, but just I read them way slower, and I didn't have that flow really. I don't know, I really enjoyed it. I think I would have absolutely loved it like 10 years ago. I think I would have been obsessed. Obviously the book hadn't come out 10 years ago, but if it had, I think it would have been like one of my absolute favorite books. It's got a very strong, to me it had a Russian Revolution vibe with like the overthrowing of the aristocracy in a quite violent way, you know, murdering children. It also has these discussions on the new regime, and is the new regime better than the old regime, because the new regime is still quite oppressive in some ways, even though it's kind of pretending not to be. So for me it gave some Russian Revolution, Soviet Union vibes. There's quite a lot of propaganda and censorship and all that kind of stuff, which obviously isn't exclusive to the Russian Revolution, but that gave me those vibes. I'm not sure if that's something that the author was specifically influenced by, but I wouldn't be surprised. So I thought those parts were really interesting. I thought the dynamic between Annie and Lee was really sweet in a lot of ways. You know, they grew up together, they became almost like siblings in the orphanage, really close friends. Sadly though, there's, you know, a romance spin, which to me felt inevitable because it's young adults, but I also didn't want it, I didn't need it. I thought it was unnecessary and kind of forced. Sorry. It's one of the reasons why I feel like young adult is maybe not for me, is the forced romance aspect. Which I know, I mean, I'm not going to say that every young adult fantasy has a forced romance, but I feel like it's almost like mandatory to like put in a random romance. He was a boy, she was a girl, can I make it any more obvious? I feel like it's kind of that level. So I didn't enjoy that part really. And I felt like this book, I wanted it to go deeper. I wanted the feelings to be deeper. I wanted the conflicts to be deeper. I wanted the grayness of certain characters to be deeper. I wanted more from it, which I don't know if I could really expect when it's young adult. And I'm not gonna say that all young adult is a little shallow, but it's the vibe I've gotten, that it's a little bit more shallow in a way. And I haven't read a lot of young adults in recent years, a lot of new young adults, so I'm not gonna pretend to be an expert, but I have certain feelings that I think are valid, which make me feel like young adults is maybe not quite for me. Which to me isn't surprising because I'm in my mid-20s, I'm not in the demographic, like I'm not a teenager, but also I know a lot of people who are older than me read tons of young adults and love it, so it's obviously not just an age thing, but I think for me it is kind of an age thing. I think I've kind of aged out of young adults in a way. That doesn't mean that I'm not still going to read more young adults. I do want to read the sequel to this because I did enjoy this. I thought it was a lot of fun, but it's so fluffy. It feels light. It feels a little shallow. Like, it's an easy read, but it doesn't leave me with like strong emotions. Now, obviously that could just be this book. I would love suggestions. If you read tons of young adult, especially if you are, you know, not of the young adult demographic and you still love it, I would love for you to give me some recommendations of things that aren't shallow. I'm not saying that this is like shallow. I thought there were a lot of interesting discussions in this and a lot of interesting emotions, but I kept wishing it would go deeper. You know, I kept wishing it to be more. And I think all of the romance stuff, honestly, was unnecessary and uninteresting, but that's just kind of me. I'm not really a romance reader. I don't really care about romance in most books that I read, so that was kind of a given for me that I wouldn't really care about those parts. I thought they were a little ham-fisted in there. But I enjoyed this world. I enjoyed the discussions that it brought up, even though I wished it would have brought them up even more, or I would have gone deeper into them. So I am going to continue with the series because it was a really quick read. It was a fun read. I feel a little bit vindicated in how little young adults I read. Let's just say that. But 3.75 stars for this one, as well as for Circe. If it had gone just a little bit deeper, and also if the ending hadn't felt quite so rushed, I think this could have been a 4-star, but it just quite missed the mark. But I still enjoyed it. The 4 novels that I read this month got on average a 3.56 average rating, which for me is quite low. So while I didn't dislike any of them, I was quite meh about the whole experience of the 4 books, which is disappointing because several of these books I thought I was absolutely going to love, especially Neverwhere and Circe. Those two I thought were going to be like out of this world for me, but they weren't. They were good, but they were like, it was a little, a little disappointing for me. So I hope I'll read some better novels going forward. Those were the novels that I read, and now I'm going to move into the graphic novel portion of this video. And all 5 of the graphic novels that I read this month were volumes of the Sandman series by Neil Gaiman as well. And if I didn't love Neverwhere quite that much, I am definitely loving Sandman. So he's redeeming himself. Now, if you watched my March TBR, in that video I said I was going to read volume 4, which is Season of Mists. And that was the only volume that I had on my TBR because I read volume 1 through 3 in 2019. And so reading volume 4 was, next in line. So that's where I started. So I read volume 4, really enjoyed it, kept going, read volume 5 because I was just in a mood and really enjoyed that too. And then I was like, oh shit, I feel like I've forgotten stuff from the first 3 volumes. Like I remember like the main story arcs and all that, but I felt like I'd forgotten little references, like little parts, and that I wasn't picking up on them in the 4th and 5th volume the way I should have. So I decided to go back and reread 1 through 3. So I read volume 4, 5, 1, 2, 3 in that order. So I read all the first 5, but just in the wrong order. But that's fine. So I'm going to talk about them in their correct order in this video, 1 through 5, just because that makes a lot more sense to me, even though I read them in kind of a jumbled order. But I'm really glad I did that reread because when I reread 1 through 3, I was like, oh shit, this is actually mentioned in this book. Like I thought that some stuff, especially in volume 4, I thought that like came out of nowhere. Like that was the first time it was mentioned, but it absolutely was not. And that whole backstory was told in one of the earlier volumes. So I just was not correct. So I'm really glad I did that reread because now I feel really ready to go forward into volume 6 and beyond when I get there. Now, the first volume in the Sandman is Preludes and Nocturnes, which, if you don't know, the Sandman series is an adult dark fantasy. It has some quite graphic horror themes, quite graphic violence. So if you're not at all okay with that, especially because they are graphic novels, right? So you are going to see images of that kind of stuff. If you can't handle anything like that, then I would say stay away. It doesn't bother me, or it does bother me a little. I'm like kind of icked out, but I'm fine with it. So you have to know yourself in that way. The Sandman series follows Dream, who is an endless, which basically means he's an eternal being, and he's like a personification of this abstract concept of dream, but he's also, the king of the dream realm, let's say. So in this first volume, Preludes and Nocturnes, we follow Dream as he has been captured by humans and kept in captivity for like several decades. And then as he, breaks free and has to kind of deal with what they've done to him as he's been captured. They've taken his like important magical items and like they're spread across the world and he has to find them, and they're, stuff's happened in the dream world when he's been gone. It's kind of crumbled without him, and it's him dealing with the aftermath of what these stupid people did when they captured him. In this first one, that's the plot line we follow. We follow Dream as he breaks free and as he goes on this kind of quest to recover these lost items. And there is a fair amount of tie-ins in this one to the like larger DC comic book universe. And for me, who hasn't read any of that and doesn't know any of that, was a little confusing, I have to say. And it's like, I don't know the people. Like, I recognize Batman, but he was barely in there. But there's like a DC villain, I believe it's a villain, I'm assuming so based on what he did in this volume, that turns up and does some really, really messed up things, some really graphic violence, you know, some really, really nightmarish stuff in here. So I don't know the context of that. I don't know the references and that kind of stuff. So for that, I think this volume doesn't work quite as well for me as it would for maybe someone who knows a lot about that kind of stuff. I still enjoy it though. I give it 4 stars, so I still thought it was really good. But I think I'm glad that it seems like the other volumes kind of move away from kind of the larger DC universe and just kind of become their own thing, because that works a lot better for me personally. The second volume in the Sandman series is The Doll's House. In this one, we follow this human girl named Rose as she tries to like figure out what's up with her family, and she's trying to find her missing younger brother. And so it's mostly focusing on Rose. It's not so much focused on Dream, even though Dream is present and he's trying to figure out some mysterious stuff on his own and some stuff that's kind of gone down while he's been gone from, you know, the first novel in his captivity. So he's trying to deal with that kind of stuff. But mostly we follow Rose and her like kind of journey. She ends up stumbling into a serial killers convention, for example, which is insane. It's such a crazy idea, but it's also creepy and weird, but also cool and fun in a weird blend. So there's some really cool ideas in this volume, and I mean in all the volumes, obviously. Neil Gaiman has a mind that I will never comprehend. I like this volume. I don't love Rose and Rose's whole story. I think I'm just not quite that attached to that whole thing. I think if I was more attached, I would have liked this volume more. But I still really liked it. I gave this one 4 as well as the first one. I don't know which one I like more. They're kind of equal but really different to me. So, but still 4, still really liked it. The third volume in the Sandman series is Dream Country. It is a lot shorter than the first 2 volumes, and it's a lot different too. This one, the first 2 have like one overarching story pretty much. And this one is 4 like completely separate stories. So it's like kind of one-shots. And so it seems like a lot of people don't, or like some people don't like this volume as much because of that. And also Dream isn't like a huge part of it necessarily. I mean, he's in there, but it kind of varies from story to story. And he's not really the main character in any of the stories. I really enjoy it. The most famous story in here, the one that's about A Midsummer Night's Dream, is actually my least favorite. But I think that's because I have never read A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I don't really have a strong connection to that play. For that doesn't connect with me as much. But the other 3 stories, especially the one about the Muse and the one about the cats, are amazing. But I also really like the one, the last story's name is called Facade, and that one is really weird and painful almost, but it does hit me quite well too. And I just love Death. Death is the best character, honestly. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. Obviously, Death is the best character. I'm gonna just say that. But I really like this. I like the one with the cats a lot, where there's this bunch of cats that are trying to like dream their way into becoming like the rulers of the world. It's awesome. If you like cats, if you have cats, I think you're gonna enjoy that story. I really like this. Out of the first 3, this is my favorite. I gave this 4.25 stars. So it's a little bit, to me, it's a little bit better than the first 2. But obviously that's gonna depend a lot on if you enjoy these 4 stories, because it really is, 4 one-shots. And I really enjoy almost all of them. I'm a little bit more on A Midsummer Night's Dream, but the other 3 I think are great. So for that, I really like this. The 4th volume, and the only one that I was originally gonna read this month after this kind of took over, is Season of Mists. And in this one, it's kind of a follow-up to a story that's told in, I believe, volume 2, about this relationship that Dream had with this woman and how she refused to be his queen, basically, and how he then condemned her to hell. And in this, the beginning of this volume, we have this family reunion of all the Endless. because Dream is an endless, but there are several other as well. They see themselves as siblings. So there's death, there's destiny, there's destruction, there's delirium, there's desire, and there's one more. I can never remember the last one. Despair. Despair is the last one. God. I can never remember despair for some reason. But they're the endless, so they have this like family reunion / meeting, and the other endless kind of call out Dream and say that, hey, what you did to this woman was not okay. Like, you shouldn't have done that. You should go, like, set that right. So he sets off to hell to get this woman out. But he's had some beef with hell and with the devil in the previous volume, and I believe in volume 1. It's, it's a little awkward for him to go back in some ways. He goes there, and stuff goes down. And one of the things that goes down is that the devil decides to quit. He decides to, stop being the devil. Like, he's not interested anymore. He decides to, close the doors of hell, kick everyone out, and be like, I'm done. And he gives the key to hell to Dream. It's really fun. It's a really interesting concept. And so Dream has to, like, decide what he's gonna do with hell. Like, what's he supposed to do with it, And there's a lot of people who want hell. There's, Norse gods, there's Egyptian gods, there's fairies, there's angels, there's like a bunch of people who want hell. And so they all come to Dream's like castle in the dream world and try and hash it out. Really interesting. It's really fun. I loved seeing all the different like mythological characters like turning up and interacting with each other, especially for me being Scandinavian. It was fun to see the Norse gods turn up because the depiction of them was just hilarious, honestly. I really enjoyed it. This was the first one I read this month, and it really got me into a groove. I gave it 4.5 stars because I really liked it, but also it didn't quite connect with me enough for me to give it 5 stars. I was like a little... And I was thinking that maybe it's just because it's a graphic novel, and maybe graphic novels can't quite connect with me as much as a novel can. But I was proven wrong when I read the 5th volume. The 5th volume is A Game of You. And in this one, we actually mainly follow a secondary tiny character from volume 2, I believe, named Barbie, and what she gets up to, and like all the people that she kind of lives with or that lives in her building. She has this really vivid internal dream life, and she kind of goes in there, and her friends try to like go after her. It's a whole thing. It's hard to describe, but Dream is not a major character in this, really. He turns up, but he's not, the main thing. And I loved this volume. I thought it was amazing. It hit me in the heart and in the soul in a way that I was not at all prepared for. There's a character in here named, I think her name is Wanda. Yeah, Wanda. She was everything to me. I loved her. I thought she was amazing. When I finished this volume, I wanted to cry. I wanted to I don't know. And especially I wanted to reread volume 1 through 3, which I then did because I was not ready to stop reading Sandman after this. 5 stars. This is my favorite volume so far, which apparently this is a lot of people's like least favorite volume, which I'm like, are you crazy? Like, this is amazing. But I guess it depends on kind of what you want. If you only like Dream, then this doesn't have much Dream, so I can get that. And, I love Dream, but I thought this volume just worked beautifully, and I loved it. What else can I say? 5 stars. So, as I said before, the actual, like, physical, like, normal novels that I read this month got a 3.56 average rating. The graphic novels, or, like, the Sandman novels that I read this month got a 4.35 average. This was a lot better. So I felt quite slumpy with the actual novels I was reading. I felt a little disappointed by a lot of them, so I'm really glad that I went on this kind of Sandman binge because it definitely picked me up and got me excited again. I think that kind of saved me from like almost a major slump. I still feel a little slumpy. Yeah, it's a new month starting today. But that's all I have. If you've read any of this, especially if you've read Sandman, I would love to hear about it. Also, if you have any, as I said, any young adult recommendations that you think could prove me wrong, then tell me about that. But otherwise, I'll see you next time. I don't really know when that will be. I don't really have any clear ideas of what I'm gonna film. I'm feeling kind of slumpy on the YouTubing as well as the reading, honestly. I just have so many other things going on and I'm not feeling like super motivated. I'm gonna try and get something up for you at least, so I'll see you then, whenever that is. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.